All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to a virtual artist talk with artist Jessica Bellamy, who's currently on display in the Tulsa World Thornton Family Gallery here at the Oklahoma Hall of Fame and Gaylord Pickens Museum. We're so happy you all could join us for this great opportunity to hear from Jessica and learn more about her current show here on display. Did want to let you all know that we will be having a reception for the artists on August 5th from 5 to 7 p.m. here at the museum. We would love for you all to be able to join us to take the time to talk with Jessica Bellamy, and an additional artist on display currently is Sunny Mercer. This here, Jessica, I want to go ahead and introduce Jessica a little bit here. Jessica is an artist and educator from Norman. She studied painting, drawing, and sculpture at Cameron and went on to receive her MFA in 2010 from Texas Women's University before becoming an adjunct professor at the university as well. Her work has been featured in solo exhibits in Texas and Oklahoma, and she has participated in group and juried exhibitions throughout the United States. She has an upcoming solo exhibit here at the Oklahoma Hall of Fame. We're very happy to have this on display. And in 2015, her work was selected to be included in the permanent collection of the Museum of Encaustic Art in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Jessica is always interested in teaching workshops and private lessons, so please make sure to reach out to her. All right, Jessica, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
All right, you can go ahead and share your PowerPoint if you'd like to, so you can display all of that.
Wonderful. I don't think it's enabled.
Okay, let's see. Okay, I can do that then. All right, I can take care of that, Jessica. If you want to just let me know when we need to switch the screen.
Okay. Thank you for that introduction, Emma. So what I'm going to be talking about today is primarily two things and kind of how they're related. I'm going to discuss who I am, how I identify culturally, and how it's informed the trajectory of my creative development as an artist. So, I mean, I'm sure many artist talks don't start with family picture time, but this is how I'm starting. At the top of this slide are my parents. My mother is predominantly of mixed European heritage, Irish, German, English. And then my father is a combination of Comanche. His mother was Comanche, and his father was Tejano, which is a Mexican-American from Texas. And I grew up very close with my mother's family. They migrated to Oklahoma during the Great Land Rush. And so they go all the way back. They got their farm in a lottery. And so I grew up on stories of the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression, about how some of our families stuck it out in Oklahoma, and other members, you know, did the whole Grapes of Wrath thing and moved to California. My father, on the other hand, he didn't talk about his heritage or his family. And that's because of a series of generational cultural traumas. And so he was, his Comanche mother was not on the tribal roll. And that's one thing I would like to make perfectly clear is I am not on the Comanche tribal roll because I don't have any documentation, because my father's mother's family chose not to live on the Bureau of Indian Affairs land allotments, and so therefore our family is not included on the census. And in order to, I think, survive socially, she chose to identify as Mexican. She spoke Spanish, and this was her way of finding social acceptance and protection in a group that was larger than her own. My father was actually given up for adoption at the age of 8, and his name was changed from Jorge Jesus Flores to Jesse Bellamy. I always think it's interesting that his adoption papers say that he's white. Growing up in Texas, he was punished for speaking Spanish at home. He was punished for speaking Spanish in schools. So he was eventually forced to forget any of his Tejano heritage in order to survive. My parents met nowhere near New Mexico or Oklahoma. They met on the island of Guam, and they ended up moving to New Mexico. So I was raised in New Mexico, in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is a wonderful place to grow up, to develop some creative abilities and appreciation for the arts. So it was a wonderful experience growing up there. Being mixed race, I learned to pass for Hispanic. And people assume that I'm familiar with the Hispanic culture because I'm from New Mexico. Or they assume that I'm familiar with Hispanic culture because of my heritage, but it's actually because I was raised in New Mexico. I was raised by a father who he didn't ever want to talk about who he was or where he came from. So finding out any information was pretty complicated for me. As I got older, he started to talk about things a little bit more. And although I felt pride in being Comanche, and I felt pride in being Tejano or Mexican American, I also felt kind of like an outsider because I didn't really feel like I fit in with any race. I was close with my mother's family, but we looked very different than the rest of the Caucasian members of the family. And so I just never really quite felt that I could truly claim a certain culture. And so that was always in my entire life, just in the back burner of my identity. You know, who am I? Because a lot of people would ask me about my ethnicity, and it was always kind of a complicated question for me to answer. As I became an adult, I moved to Oklahoma, and I began the art program at Cameron University. And one of my mentors, one of my sculpture professors, kept telling me that I should really explore my ethnicity through my art. And I really avoided that for a long time. And he was right. He was right that that was someplace I should explore, but I just wasn't ready to yet because I was so afraid of being misinformed and disingenuous. And I didn't understand how I could visually explore cultures that I wasn't raised being a part of. So if you could go on to the next slide, Emma. When I got into grad school, I kind of started going in that direction. The first year of grad school, if any of you guys have never been to grad school as a visual artist, tends to be a really confusing time. It's a good time though, that confusion is really good. So I came into grad school absolutely terrified, thinking I need to create this world-changing prophetic art. And so I was exploring ideas of technology and social disconnect. And to be perfectly honest, the work wasn't that good. And that's another thing people should be aware of is a lot of artists make a lot of not so good work, and that's just a part of the process. But I took a Native American art history class, and there were 6 textbooks in this class, and I read every single textbook from front to back. I just ate up all of the information because I was connecting to it and identifying with it. So I started incorporating Native American imagery and into the technology and the image references to the technology. So on the left is an image called Requiem, and that pattern on that shroud it's a photo transfer of the circuitry of a computer keyboard. But what I did was I integrated that with my interpretation of a Plains tribe funerary platform. I especially researched art and practices of Plains tribes being Comanche, because they're from the Southern Plains. And so that was a big primary point of interest for me. And migratory Plains tribes did not they tended not to bury their dead. They tended to put them on funerary platforms. and they would let the birds take their flesh up, and they kind of saw that as some cultures saw that as a way to ascend from the corporal world to from the physical world to the heavenly world. And on the right is a piece that I created called Winter Count. This is a winter count is a practice that nomadic tribes would they had what they called a winter count robe. And it was a ceremony where every year they would pull out this very special robe, and it was their way of record keeping the history of their clan. And so for each year, they would find one icon to pretty much record that year. Instead of using a year like 2021, it would be one simple image. And the images would, that the robe would just be full of all these different images. And it was a way of record keeping the history of their people. And so I reinterpreted that idea, using icons for each year of my life. And instead of using a hide, an actual animal hide, I used roofing rubber and speaker wire, and I welded the frame out of steel. So it was kind of a combination of a traditional idea and interpreting it through more contemporary technological means. If you could go to the next slide. So I eventually, through all my research and exploring, I decided to really focus in on this connection I was making with the Native American art practices, and the sculpture just really forced me to start thinking that way. And the culmination of that was the work that was in my thesis exhibit. And what I started doing was I started collecting and finding objects. People would give me things, I would find them, and I would manipulate them and through this craft practice. You know, craft is a big part of Indian culture, and they don't have there was no delineation between, you know, fine art and crafts and utilitarian objects. They made their utilitarian objects beautiful and they used them. And so I really connected with that idea. So I would collect things, and I would meet people who would give me things. Like I made friends with a taxidermist, and he would give me porcupine quills and bones and skulls, and I would make these little fetishes that were precious to me. And that's how all of the painting started, was by making these objects and then integrating them into a ground that had a contradictory background, because I would find architectural floor plans, and I would use like in this image, Sun Secret, that's just a solar chart on the right. And I always tried to connect the meaning of the fetish, or those connections with the different Plains tribes cultures. So in some Plains tribes, the porcupine is a symbol for the sun, and it represents heat and energy. And because the porcupine, when it flares up, it looks like the rays of the sun. And so I was making that connection with that piece. And so I feel like I had a really successful body of work from that. And then I graduated. If you could go to the next slide. Next slide. And after I graduated, I felt a little bit adrift about where I should go, because the thesis exhibit is such a huge undertaking. And so one thing that I like to practice, and I learned from doing this, is if I don't know what to do, I just draw. And starting with the paintings that I did for my thesis exhibit, the Give and Take series, That's where I started incorporating the feathers. For me, birds are very, very precious for very personal reasons. Um, I see them as kind of messengers of hope. I see them as connections to loved ones that have passed. And so the feathers are always gonna like it's a gonna be a pretty consistent theme throughout the work that you see here. Um, so what I did with this series was instead of working with actual feathers, I decided to draw birds without their feathers. I really wanted to redevelop my drawing abilities, and so I focused on anatomical skeletal studies of birds. But what I did is I gave myself some rules. I like to give myself rules and parameters in my art. I think it's the part of me that always feels like I'm learning and like I'm a student. I think I feel safety in the rules. And so my rules for these pieces were that any drawing I started, I had to finish. I could not throw it away. I could not start over. That was rule number one. Rule number two was I couldn't pre-draw anything with any media that could be erased. So they were all drawn with ink. So that's pretty scary. And if I made any mistakes, I had to integrate that into the final product. And when you draw, you make a lot of mistakes because drawing is a series of adjusting and looking and adjusting and looking. And so all of these images were initially drawn using another rule I set for myself was I would use non-traditional drawing implements for the initial drawing. So I was using walnut ink and a bamboo stylus or a homemade feather quill or sticks, or some of them I used porcupine quills to draw with. And then once I established the shape to where that the form to where I thought it was accurate, I would go in and I would add some value contrast with a black ink pen. But this was a really good series for me to kind of work through. And there's still that connection with, nature and in a very loose way to my culture through just my connection with the feathers. If you could go to the next slide. As I was working on the bird drawings, I started paying attention to what was happening in the world in relation to fossil fuels. And things were going on with the Keystone Pipeline and the Dakota Access Pipeline. And I was reading about different tribes losing their properties, losing their lands to for the sake of drilling. And I also, it harkened back to the history of what happened in Oklahoma, with tribes like the Osage. And I wanted to kind of explore that, but I didn't want to do it very literally. I wanted to go in an abstract path towards this. I wanted to really focus on color and texture. So as I was doing my research of the sources of fossil fuels and how they develop and how they're extracted from the earth, I started coming across images of plants, because fossil fuels are the remains of plants and animals that have decayed and they become compressed under the earth, and that decomposition process produces the energy for oil and for natural gas. That's the source of fossil fuels. So I started looking at the sources. So that's why this series is called Source. And I was really, really drawn to these microscopic images of the xylem and phloem of these plants. And so that's where I was, I decided to focus on. So with the image on the bottom left, That's called Preserve the Light. And that is actually a microscopic image of a ginkgo leaf. All of the plants that I focused on for this series, they're what are called living fossils, which means they're species that are still living today that were living in prehistoric eras. And so I really focused on those. The image on the left, vertical disruption, that is a microscopic image of a Woolemi pine tree. And then the top image, reticulated space, that is a horsetail plant. And I built up all of the surfaces of these images using various types of plasters. And then I would work over them with thin washes of fluid acrylic paint, acrylic and acrylic inks. And so, but that process of working on these was really important because it helped me reconnect with my joy of the intuitive nature of the painting process. And I really loved bringing back in vibrant colors into my work and pushing and pulling spaces back and forth. And, but the series did exhaust itself, and I wasn't really sure where I wanted to go from there. If you could go to the next slide. So, anytime I feel lost as creatively adrift, rather, is a good word, a better way to put it. Like I did with the birds, I set a new project and I give myself rules. And it really works for me to break out. So what I started was what I called my letter project. And what I did was every week I would write a letter to somebody who had made a positive impact in my life. And they would be famous people or friends or family members. It didn't matter. I just sat down and I made a list of names of people. And what I did was I would write a letter, and each letter, it would be a big piece of folded paper, that I would fold over. And it was a heavy stock of paper. So each letter had about half a sheet worth where I would create an intuitive artwork directly on the letter. And my rules for this were whatever image I started, very much like the birds, whatever I started, I had to finish, and that's what the recipient of that letter was going to get. And whenever I started writing the letter, also like the birds, I had to write it in ink. There was no erasing, and whatever I wrote is what they got. And that forced me to really think about the intimacy of writing letters and how it forces you to slow down and think about what you want to say, makes us consider our words. There's a different connection that we make when we handwrite letters that I feel has been a little bit lost in the age of emailing and texting. And I wanted to go back to the idea of the handwritten letter. And this project, it made me feel very vulnerable, but it was very empowering at the same time, because I felt like I was doing such, for me, who's tends to be a little bit more reserved, it was a very brave project for me to take on. And I shared the letters. I shared the letters and little snippets of the letters. I shared the artwork and little snippets of the letters. I kind of turned them into a form of poetry. That's what you see on the right side of the screen. And then I would share them on a blog. And I was amazed by the responses I got from people. A lot of people didn't write back, and I never expected people to write me back, but other people did. And it was a very special project, and it's one that I might want to revisit again. But I think the important part that I got out of this was this ability to just kind of work a little bit more intuitively. And I was looking at the imagery I was creating, and I was making these connections, these shapes that are reminiscent of, you know, American Indian iconography. the circles, the cardinal directions come into my work, and the choice of colors and the feathers, always the feathers, they keep coming back. And but it was nice because I could see what was coming out of me intuitively in this process. And I started thinking, and I realized that I was actually had been over the past 10 years working on creating my own visual dialogue of who I am culturally. Because I always felt like an outsider as a person who is a quarter Comanche and a quarter Mexican American. I always felt like an outsider to these things, but I was developing my own language, and that was very empowering to me. So what I decided to do was I decided to kind of treat some of these images that I had created in the letter project as sketches for paintings. And if you go to the next slide, Emma. And so this is the first one I did, and we're going to toggle back between the last slide and this slide. And you can definitely see the connection between this image and the image on the previous slide for that top image. And so that top image inspired this piece right here. And this is titled For Chris. It was a letter that I wrote to Chris Gethard. He hosts a podcast that I really love to listen to. Oh, another thing, I people I've written to that never wrote me back include the artist Jim Dine. Chris Gethard never wrote me back. So I wrote to a lot of artists. I wrote to some, I wrote a letter to, at the time, Barack Obama was president, and I actually got a response from Barack Obama. So that was super, super exciting. It was pretty amazing. But there was some pretty wild reaching letters that I sent to some people. But anyway, so this image was the first of the large pieces. It's 24 inches by 24 inches. And it's, I like to always look for shapes and patterns and things that I can incorporate to create motifs in my work. And some people ask me, did you paint all of that lace? No, I didn't. Well, I mean, I did, but I painted it using a stencil. So I find lace tablecloths or placemats, plastic lace, or I find different things I can stamp with. I'm always looking for things that I can create interesting textures and patterns with in my work. And that feather there is a feather off of a scarlet macaw that a friend gave to me. As people started to, look at my art and realize that I used feathers, it was pretty amazing that people would just pick up feathers and give them to me. And they would just walk up to me and give me a bag of feathers, or they mail me feathers. And I think it's pretty amazing how you can inspire other people through your work, people who don't identify as being creative. You can inspire them to slow down and look at the ground and what's going on around them. And then they think of you and they give you these, to me, precious objects that can become part of a piece of art. The next slide. So this one is also Gothic Dreams, more macaw feathers, and also a lace stencil. Sometimes I use paint when I do the stenciling, and sometimes I use plaster to create a raised texture surfaces. Sometimes I stamp into plaster to create an embossed surface. It just kind of depends on what works best for the image. There's a much more intuitive nature to these paintings that I really enjoy, just responding to the color and the texture, and the struggle of trying to integrate and resolve a unified piece of art just by using things like color and texture. But I still create these, I always manipulate the feathers in these pieces. I never just stick them on there. I wrap them or I connect them into different shapes. And themes that are pretty consistent in my work are the color red and copper. And so the quills of these feathers are very carefully wrapped in really, really fine copper wire. And that's because I consider copper to be a conduit of power and energy. And I also consider red to be a very empowering color. So those will come up a lot, is that the red and the copper. Next slide. So these are little tiny, I'm not even sure what feathers these are. A friend sent them to me and I just absolutely loved them. And so this was a much more complicated piece for me to resolve because of the colors and the texture. And that happens sometimes as I start creating these images and textures and the washes of color. And I'm not really sure how I'm going to pull it all together. But I think part of my process is getting to a point where I just have to stop and walk away and come back, or just take a big risk if the painting's fighting what I have set in my head as the image of it. Because that happens sometimes as we get stuck on an idea of the way something's gonna be, how the finished product's gonna be, and I have to actually acquiesce and give in to what the image wants to do. And sometimes that involves taking a big risk, and then it either pays off or I cover it up and start over again. Next slide. This is a good example of the embossing. I had a block that I stamped. I built up texture with plaster, and then I pushed into it to get that pattern, and I really, it disrupted the pattern. I like working with the plaster. I like the way the paint reacts to it. I like the way the paint falls away from the raised areas and puddles in the more recessed areas. And I like how I can dry brush on top on the raised areas and get really nice highlights. I just think there's a really nice depth, and I feel like it makes the images look almost kind of like they're painted on rock, like, paintings inside of a cave or petroglyphs. And I kind of make that connection with it. This is a turkey feather that my grandfather gave me. He picked it up on his farm and he gave me that turkey feather. So I always try to have a personal connection with every piece that I put, every feather that I incorporate into the work. Next slide. This is one of the more recent ones I've done. And I had so much fun working on this painting. And the finished effect, it to me looks like a cross between patinaed bronze and turquoise, and the actual stone turquoise. And it was pretty unintentional, but I saw what was happening in a small area of the painting and I just went with it because I loved that effect. And I think that's an important part of the painting process, is when unexpected things happen, is to pay attention to that and take advantage of it. And what did I do to make that happen? And how can I control this? And how can I make it happen more? And this was a piece that went that way. And it's once again a plastered surface. And I embossed into it with a stamp. I found a great textile stamp, and the entire quill is wrapped in copper. And then it's kind of hard to see in this image, but there's copper, there's lines of copper that are coming out from the side of the quill horizontally. And this one, like a lot of my other paintings, they have personal connections, and I named them after times in my life that what's going on in my life at the time. And so that's why some of the titles might seem a little bit mysterious. It's just because I'm connecting them with a certain time in my life. Next slide. Another thing I had fun with, this is also in the exhibit. This was just kind of a bit of a digression for me, but a really fun one was I took a workshop in alternative image making. And so these are some prints that I made. They're also called, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the name. But so what these are is it's basically the same solution that they use to make architectural blueprints, and it's ultraviolet light sensitive. And so in the workshop, we painted the paper with this solution, and we would put objects on top of the paper and then take it outside and expose it to the sun. And wherever the object was blocking the sun from the paper is where the paper would be white. And I decided to take that process and try to do it with fabric, and then kind of see what that would happen. And it was a very, very messy process, but I really enjoyed it. And I took images. This is kind of a connecting piece to the other images that I'm working on, is where I'm collecting natural elements or natural objects from outside. And so and also has the feathers, and it's got that kind of lace pattern in there. But each of these was, each of the prints was mounted. I mounted the fabric on a piece of wood panel, and then I've put several layers of encaustic medium on top of that. So the next images we're going to go into, they all involve encaustic medium. You can skip forward, Emma. And encaustic medium is it's one of the most ancient forms of painting. It's a combination of beeswax and damar crystals, which help stabilize that wax so it doesn't melt so fast and get so sticky. And I use the encaustic in a very non-traditional way. When I first moved to Oklahoma, I was going for long walks in the spring, and I saw all of these maple seeds falling out of the trees. Some people call them helicopters, other people call them propellers. To me, they look like insect wings. That's kind of the visual connection I would make with them. But they just made me smile because I just saw them floating down and twirling and twirling. And so I collected some on a walk, and I incorporated some into a small painting. And I loved it so much, and I loved how the encaustic medium worked with it. So what I do is I build up several layers of wax, and then heat that wax up, and then push very, very, very carefully and delicately push that those pods into it, and then I would put more encaustic medium on top to stabilize them and seal them in, hold them in place. And I loved working that way. And I started thinking about, what did I love so much about it? I loved the act of collecting them, because after I discovered that I liked working with them, I had to wait a whole nother year to collect some, because by the time I did anything with them, it was past the season for them to fall off the trees. And so I thought, and this idea percolated for almost an entire year. And I just kept visually in my brain thinking, how can I do this? And I just was thinking, I'm just seeing tons of these pods on a panel. So I was planning it, not very formally, but in my head, constantly thinking about it off and on throughout the year. And so I was finally able to gather all of them. And then I realized that the act of harvesting the maple pods was very important to me. At first I thought, people are going to think I'm a crazy lady because I just walk outside with a bag and I'm just, hunkering down on the ground and scooping up these maple pods. It does look strange. I know it looks strange, but I was making this connection with hunting and gathering, cultures. And it's like, that's what I'm doing. I'm gathering. And for some reason, that was a very intimate, special moment for me. Next slide. And so I decided to keep exploring with it. This one is called Volusion, and it's this is a bunch of segments from the cones off of a fir tree. I think pine cones I was very familiar with growing up in New Mexico, but they're very compact. But the fir cones I learned on, just by going for walks, is that when they fall on the ground, they just go to pieces and all of these segments come apart. And I just love the shape of those segments. And so the inspiration for these pieces, it starts with the walk, and it starts with me just paying attention to what's around me, looking at the shapes of things, and the feel of them, and how they could look next to each other. And so it starts with that act of just looking and picking them up, and then thinking about what I can do with them. And sometimes I don't even know, like, I don't know what I'm going to do with them, but I just know I need these. I'm going to collect these. And so I collected segments off of fir trees. I would just go for walks and constantly look for them, and I would just keep a bag on me, and I would just collect some and collect some, a little bit more until I had enough for a painting. And I decided with this one and another piece to kind of play with the idea of the golden ratio and the Fibonacci sequence, which is this, it's a divine ratio that keeps reappearing in nature all the time. And we incorporate that in a lot of, we're trained as artists to incorporate that ratio into how we split up the primary areas of interest on a painting. So it's kind of ingrained in most artists to be aware of that. Next slide. This one is recurrence. This is, these are hydrangea petals. They came off of I think it was called an oak leaf hydrangea was the breed of it. Sometimes when I want to collect things, I can just find them on the ground. Other times I have to knock on somebody's door and try to make them know that I'm not crazy, and ask them, hey, can I have these? Can I take some of your dried hydrangea petals? And that's what I did to get these. This man had this beautiful hydrangea plant, and I was just keeping an eye on it. And I would watch them bloom. I'd walk by his house several times a week, and I watched them bloom, and then I watched them dry up. And you always, to work with these plants, they always have to be completely dried. If they're not dried, you're going to have some molding problems. So when they were dried, I just knocked on his door and asked him if I could clip them off, and he was very happy. I mean, people, when you ask them for stuff, just like the taxidermist I told you about earlier, if you tell them I'm an artist and I really would like to get some of, these objects to make a painting, they're usually so excited to help. It makes them feel really special. So I kind of saw a visual connection with almost like tile motifs and patterns with this one, and I just decided to really play that up. Working on these two, the process of actually assembling them, it's kind of freeing, because I work on these images at the same time as I work on my paintings with the feathers and the patterns. It's kind of a nice break, because these ones do have to be very well planned out. I have to have a pattern planned, and it's kind of nice just to work and just know that I'm going to be, laying down wax, fusing the wax. That's where we heat the wax up between layers so they melt together and stabilize. And just building these patterns, it's kind of that repetitive process is kind of meditative for me. Next one. So this is, this is related to the Volusion one where I told you I was thinking about the golden ratio, the Fibonacci sequence. And these are the caps off of acorns. So I collected a bunch of acorn caps and sorted them by size and by, lightness or darkness. And this one was really a really challenging one to work on, but it was fun because it was a little bit more bright and vibrant than the others. Next one. And this is the most recent one I completed. This is called Bloom. I really had a lot of fun working on this one. These are the seed pods off of redbud trees. And I had a fun time kind of creating these almost suture-like lines that kind of intersect and cross the uh, the picture plane, and using these using the pods to create other floral motifs that kind of come in from the sides. And this one has it's a big one, and working with encaustic medium on a large painting like this is really challenging, but I had a lot of fun with the challenge of it. And so for all of these, what I do is I build up color underneath on the wood panel. I build up really vibrant colors, and then I put layer after layer of wax down, and that kind of mutes the color. And so that's kind of how some of that effect is achieved with these paintings. I think that's the last one, isn't it, Emma? Yeah.
Yes, ma'am, it is.
Great.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing that. And Jessica, thank you so much for sharing all of this with us. It's been awesome to be able to hear kind of the inspiration in your process and how you've developed as an artist. We do have a couple of questions in the chat that I wanted to kind of ask you about.
Sure.
The first one is, with the rule of not allowing yourself to start over on projects, did you ever find yourself struggling to finish projects? And if so, how did you move past that?
You know, it didn't. I didn't find myself struggling to finish projects because I think having that rule forced me. Setting that rule forced me. It's like, I have to finish this project. I have to. And so if I hit a kink or a challenge, I would, you know, this is a really good practice for any artist, is if you're struggling, walk away. Just walk away, come back, and, you know, can you, and sometimes it takes a really brave act, a really dangerous act, and for an artist, that could be like a really heavy stroke of black somewhere, you know, or something really scary to you, or you feel like you might do something that's going to ruin the image. But if you just do that, it can force you to just find other ways to rework the image. So instead of starting over, I would just tell myself, I have to rework this and approach it from a different angle. Or, you know, if I was working on one of the bird drawings and I got something really off, well, you know, how can I integrate that? Well, I'll just put some blooms of ink there and I'll reestablish a new line, you know. So there are ways of hiding things that are wrong and burying them without having to start over.
Awesome. And another one we have is, the thinking behind your art tells such an amazing story, and I appreciate that everything you do has intent behind it. On the contrary, I am curious about which of your ideas did not turn out as you envisioned it initially.
Which one turned out not? I would definitely, a good example would be the work I did in grad school. I didn't show early grad school work because it's just not good. There's technical ability there, but it's just kind of conceptually empty. So my graduate school experience was me struggling the first 2 years, having small successes here and there, but the first 2 years I was in grad school, it just was not going well. And then finally it you know, started to come together. But I think that things don't go as planned a lot with a lot of my paintings, and I just have to kind of adapt. So it does happen with paintings all the time, especially with the feather paintings and the source paintings, is when you're working a little bit more abstractly, or when you're working just specifically with like the elements of art and not just trying to draw something or paint something realistically, things very, very rarely go the way that you plan.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we had one other, it was that you mentioned taking a Native American art history class while in grad school. After that class, was there a Native American artist that you felt most inspired by, and do you still feel that connection today?
Yes. And he's actually a living practicing artist, and his name is John Hitchcock. I became acquainted with him because he was an alum of Cameron University, and he, like me, he's half Comanche, half Caucasian, and he had, he was lucky in that he was able to grow up as a part of the Comanche tribe, and he was just he's a prolific, amazing artist, and I'm always following what he does. If you guys are interested in his work, his website is called The Hybrid Press, and he calls himself a ethnic hybrid, and his work is absolutely amazing and collaborative, and very inspiring to me. And to me, that's important, is to find contemporary Native American artists that inspire you.
Absolutely. And the last question we have is, what's next? What's the next project? Do you have one already lined up?
That is a very good question, and I do not know yet. I'm still I've got my eyes on some leaves on a tree at a friend's house, and I think that I'm going to continue to work in both of these series, because I don't feel like they are I don't feel like they've been exhausted yet. I'm not tired of them yet. I'm not feeling pulled to go anywhere just yet. So yeah.
I think that's great. I think it's great that you're continuing to build on projects, and it kind of comes back to not letting yourself start over and not letting yourself
Right.
some of those rules that you set up. So I think it's great that you're still continuing to work on these projects.
Yeah, and I really want to revisit the letter project again. I think I'm at a very different point in my life now than I was when I did that 5 years ago, and I think it would be very nice to reconnect with people and connect with new people. So that's one thing I might be doing.
I think that's awesome. I think it's great that you're continuing these projects and not letting yourself finish with them until they are finished. I think that's
great.
Well, good. Well, Jessica, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing so much of your story and your process with us. I did want to remind everyone that the show is on display until August 21st, so make sure to come down and see it. It's a beautiful show. We do have a artist reception on Thursday, August 5th from 5 to 7 p.m. So make sure you guys are available and can come down and check that out and have a chance to talk with Jessica as well. So Jessica, thank you again so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
All right, thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you guys.